In the sun-scorched plains of Montana, where dust devils danced across endless horizons and silence could hollow out a soul, Abigail Winters' ranch stood like a weathered monument to isolation. What had once been a thriving cattle operation built, with dreams of prosperity, had withered into nothing more than a daily reminder of everything she'd sacrificed. But on this blistering August afternoon, as temperatures climbed past 105 degrees, fate would deliver 10 unexpected souls to her doorstep. These weren't just any children seeking shelter. They carried with them a tattered envelope that would shatter everything Abigail thought she knew about courage, redemption, and the true meaning of home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter, written in a child's determined handwriting, contained just 5 words that would haunt Abigail for months to come. 5 words that would force her to confront her deepest fears and ultimately choose between the safety of her solitude and the terrifying possibility of connection. The children who carried those words had traveled over 200 miles on foot, surviving on determination and scraps, bearing a truth so profound it would transform not just Abigail's life but the entire community of Silver Creek. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the pre-dawn darkness at exactly 4:15, same as it had every morning for the past 11 years. Abigail Winters' calloused hand silenced it with the practiced precision of someone whose routine had become her religion. The queen-sized bed felt unnecessarily large around her lean frame, the empty space beside her a constant reminder of what life had stolen from her that terrible summer. James had always been an early riser, up before her with coffee brewing and breakfast plans already forming in his mind. His deep laugh would echo through their bedroom as he planned the day ahead, that familiar sound carrying down the hallway like music. Now the ranch house held only silence, broken occasionally by the settling of timbers that had weathered too many seasons without proper care. Abigail swung her legs over the side of the bed, bare feet finding the cool hardwood floor. At 42, her body carried the accumulated aches of 2 decades working cattle under the relentless Montana sun. Her knees protested as she stood, a sharp reminder of the riding accident that had fractured her left leg in 3 places and ended her rodeo dreams 15 years ago. Back then, James had nursed her through months of recovery, his gentle hands working the knotted muscles in her back while he whispered promises about the legacy they'd build together. The bathroom mirror reflected a woman who had aged beyond her years. Chestnut hair, once thick and vibrant, now held streaks of silver that she never bothered to hide. Green eyes that had once sparkled with determination now carried the flat exhaustion of someone going through motions without purpose. The laugh lines around her mouth had deepened into permanent creases that spoke more of grimacing through pain than genuine joy. James used to trace those lines with his fingertips, calling them proof of a life well lived. He'd promised they'd earn many more together. Downstairs, the kitchen felt like a museum of abandoned possibilities. James' collection of hand-carved wooden figurines still lined the windowsill, gathering dust in the morning light. The herb garden he'd planted outside the kitchen window had long since withered, replaced by stubborn weeds that seemed to mock her inability to nurture anything beautiful. The refrigerator hummed its lonely song, filled with nothing but cowhand basics, beer, leftover stew, eggs, and milk approaching its expiration date. Coffee came from a machine that had seen better days, its once gleaming surface now dulled with age and neglect. Abigail measured the grounds with mechanical precision, muscle memory guiding her movements while her mind wandered to the endless list of repairs awaiting her attention. The north pasture fence needed reinforcing before winter. The barn roof leaked whenever it rained. 3 of her best breeding heifers showed signs of illness that probably required expensive veterinary care. The Winters Ranch had once been the pride of Silver Creek, spanning nearly 3,000 acres of prime grazing land inherited from Abigail's grandfather. Old Jack Winters had built the spread from nothing, starting with 30 head of cattle and a determination that could outmatch the Montana wilderness. By the time Abigail and James took over the operation, it supported over 600 head and employed 8 full-time ranch hands. Neighbors spoke of the Winters legacy with respect, knowing that 3 generations of backbreaking work had created something lasting and valuable. That was before the wildfire that consumed the western pastures, before the drought that followed, before the market crash that devastated cattle prices, before James's diagnosis changed everything. Now Abigail worked the ranch alone, her pride, preventing her from selling despite the mounting financial pressure. The once bustling bunkhouse sat empty, its windows boarded up against the elements. Most of the pasture land lay fallow, supporting maybe 75 head of cattle that Abigail could barely afford to feed. The mortgage payments grew heavier each month, and the bank in town had started sending letters with increasingly urgent language about exploring alternative arrangements. She pulled on her work clothes with the same methodical approach she brought to everything: faded Levi's soft with age, a blue chambray shirt that had been James's favorite, and boots that had walked thousands of miles across this unforgiving landscape. Her worn leather gloves hung from a hook by the back door, their surfaces molded to the shape of her hands through years of gripping rope, fence posts, and cattle gates. The screen door creaked as she stepped onto the back porch, and Abigail made a mental note to oil the hinges before fall. The morning air carried the familiar scent of sage and dust, with the distant promise of heat. August in Montana meant temperatures that could kill anything caught without shade or water. The thermometer mounted beside the door already read 75 degrees, and the sun hadn't fully cleared the eastern ridge. Her morning routine began with checking the cattle in the near pasture, a ritual that connected her to every rancher who had worked this land before her. The 75 head she maintained were a mixture of Angus and Hereford crosses, hardy breeds suited to Montana's harsh climate. They gathered around the stock tank like congregants at a Sunday service, their massive heads dipping to drink from water that Abigail pumped fresh each morning from the well her grandfather had dug by hand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cattle knew her by sight and sound, barely lifting their heads as she approached. These weren't pets, but they represented security in an uncertain world. Each animal had a value measured in dollars and cents, but to Abigail, they meant independence, the ability to work for herself rather than punching a time clock for some corporation that would discard her when quarterly profits demanded cuts. Walking the fence line had become a meditation of sorts, a time when Abigail could let her mind wander while her hands performed familiar tasks. Today she found 4 places where wire had sagged under constant pressure from cattle leaning against the posts. The repairs required nothing more than fence pliers and determination, but each weakness reminded her of larger problems she couldn't afford to address. The entire fence system needed replacement, but new wire and posts cost money she didn't have. In the distance, the main barn dominated the horizon like a cathedral dedicated to agricultural life. Built from local timber in 1945, the structure had weathered decades of Montana seasons with the stubborn resilience of quality craftsmanship. Abigail's grandfather had overseen its construction, insisting on details that modern builders might consider unnecessary: hand-forged hinges, mortise and tenon joints that would last centuries, and a foundation of native stone that would outlive them all. The barn held memories in every shadow and corner. James had insisted on hosting their wedding reception there, decorating the old beams with white lights and wildflowers he'd picked from the surrounding meadows. 200 guests had danced on the wooden floor while her uncle played fiddle, and cousins provided harmony that echoed off the rafters. Abigail could still hear the music sometimes, late at night when sleep eluded her and the empty house felt too quiet for comfort. Inside the barn, swallows nested in the high beams, their mud constructions adding to the organic feeling of a building that had grown rather than been constructed. Hay bales from last summer's cutting still filled the loft, though Abigail knew she'd need to buy more feed before winter if the drought continued. The smell of dry grass and leather tack created an atmosphere that spoke of honest work and simple pleasures. Her favorite horse, a chestnut mare named Penny, occupied the first stall. The animal was getting older, maybe 18 years, but her gentle nature and steady disposition made her perfect for the solitary work that had become Abigail's life. Penny nickered softly as Abigail approached, hoping for the apple slices that James used to sneak from the kitchen. These days, a handful of grain from the feed bucket had to suffice. The morning feeding routine gave structure to days that might otherwise drift away without purpose. Each animal had specific dietary needs, and Abigail had learned to read their individual temperaments and health indicators. The old bull, Thunder, required careful handling despite his advanced age. The pregnant heifers needed extra nutrition to support their developing calves. The working horses demanded high-energy feed to maintain their strength and stamina. By 7:30, the sun had gained enough strength to make the work uncomfortable. Abigail retreated to the shade of the barn's overhang, wiping sweat from her forehead with a faded bandana that had belonged to her father. The silence pressed against her like a physical weight, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the buzzing of insects that thrived in Montana's summer heat. This was when loneliness hit hardest, in the quiet moments between tasks when her mind had time to wander. James would have been up for hours by now, probably fixing the equipment in the workshop or planning improvements to the irrigation system. He had possessed an energy that seemed inexhaustible, a genuine love for the land that drew people to him like moths to flame. The house had always been full of visitors in those days, neighbors seeking advice, friends stopping by for coffee, local 4-H kids wanting to learn about livestock management. Now the phone rarely rang, and when it did, the caller usually wanted money she didn't have or was trying to sell her something she couldn't afford. The social connections that had once defined her life had withered along with everything else, leaving her isolated in the middle of 3,000 acres that felt more like a prison than a paradise. Abigail forced herself to focus on immediate concerns, rather than dwelling on what couldn't be changed. The hay needed cutting soon, assuming she could afford fuel for the ancient John Deere that had been threatening to die for the past 4 seasons. The cattle required vaccination updates, another expense that would strain her already tight budget. The house needed new shingles, fresh paint, and a dozen other maintenance tasks that she kept putting off in hopes that somehow circumstances would improve. The truth was becoming harder to ignore with each passing month. The ranch was dying a slow death, strangled by debt and neglect, and one woman's stubborn refusal to admit defeat. Logic suggested selling out to one of the big agricultural corporations that had been circling like vultures, waiting for her resolve to finally crack. The money would pay off her debts and leave enough for a comfortable retirement in town. Maybe a small house with a manageable yard and neighbors close enough to borrow sugar. But selling felt like betrayal of everyone who had worked to build the Winters legacy. Her grandfather's calloused hands had cleared this land and built the first structures. Her father had expanded the operation and established the family's reputation for honest dealing and quality livestock. James had poured his heart into making the ranch a true home, a place where family and friends could gather to celebrate life's important moments. The sound of a truck engine interrupted her brooding thoughts. Abigail shaded her eyes against the morning sun, watching a dust cloud approach along the gravel road that connected her ranch to the outside world. Visitors were rare enough that each one deserved attention, though she hoped this wasn't another representative from the bank or some government agency with new regulations that would cost her money she didn't have. The truck turned out to be Elena Rodriguez's old Chevy, its red paint faded to rust and its bed loaded with fencing supplies. Elena owned the neighboring spread to the east, a smaller operation that she managed with help from her 3 grown children. They'd been friends since childhood, learning to ride and rope together under the tutelage of their respective fathers. Elena was one of the few people who still visited regularly, usually bearing news from town or offering to help with projects that required more than one pair of hands. "Morning, Abby," Elena called as she climbed out of the cab. Her own face showed the weathering of outdoor work, though at 45 she carried herself with the energy of someone who still believed in the future. "Brought those fence posts we talked about. Figure we can tackle that north section this weekend if you're game." Abigail felt a familiar mixture of gratitude and embarrassment at her friend's offer. Elena had her own ranch to maintain, her own family to support, yet she regularly donated time and materials to help Abigail keep the Winters place functioning. It was the kind of neighborly assistance that had once been common in rural Montana, though economics and changing demographics had made such generosity increasingly rare. "Don't suppose you've got time for coffee," Abigail said, gesturing toward the house. "Just made a fresh pot." Elena checked her watch and nodded. "Always got time for your coffee. Miguel says mine tastes like mud." They walked toward the house. Together, 2 women bound by shared history and mutual respect, despite the growing differences in their circumstances. Elena's ranch was thriving, benefiting from her willingness to embrace new technologies and marketing strategies. She diversified into organic beef, charging premium prices to urban customers who valued the ranch-to-table story. Her daughter, Carmen, had started a successful business selling homemade salsas and preserves to specialty shops in Bozeman and Missoula. In the kitchen, Abigail poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, while Elena examined a collection of unpaid bills stacked on the counter. The silence stretched uncomfortably as both women acknowledged realities that neither wanted to discuss openly. Elena's friendship was genuine, but it couldn't solve problems that required capital and business acumen that Abigail seemed to have lost along with everything else. "Bank called again?" Elena asked finally, her tone carefully neutral. Abigail nodded, unable to meet her friend's eyes. "They want me to come in next week, talk about restructuring the loan." "Might not be the worst thing," Elena said gently. "Sometimes a fresh start beats beating your head against a wall that ain't going to budge." The words stung because they carried the weight of truth. Abigail had been beating her head against that wall for 11 years, telling herself that determination and hard work could overcome any obstacle. Her grandfather and father had faced droughts and market crashes and somehow survived, building something lasting despite the challenges. But they'd had partners, families, communities of support that Abigail had allowed to slip away in her grief. "James always said this place had good bones," Abigail said, surprising herself by speaking his name aloud. She rarely mentioned her late husband to anyone, not even Elena. Said it just needed the right people to bring it back to life. Elena set down her coffee mug and studied her friend's face. "Maybe he was thinking about more than just you and him." Before Abigail could ask what she meant, the conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both women freeze. Voices coming from the direction of the barn. Young voices speaking in urgent whispers that carried clearly in the still morning air. Abigail and Elena exchanged glances, both women immediately alert to the possibility of trespassers or, worse, someone injured and seeking help. They moved toward the barn with the cautious steps of people who understood that rural Montana could present dangers ranging from wild animals to desperate people fleeing their own troubles. The voices grew clearer as they approached, revealing what sounded like children engaged in some kind of heated discussion. Abigail's first thought was that local kids had decided to use her empty barn as a playground, though the remote location made that unlikely. Elena placed a restraining hand on Abigail's arm as they reached the barn's main entrance. "Let me go first," she whispered. "Got kids of my own." But Abigail was already moving, driven by something stronger than caution. The voices were coming from the back corner of the barn near the old grain storage bins that hadn't been used in years. As her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, Abigail could make out small figures huddled together in the shadows, their whispered conversation stopping abruptly as they became aware of her presence. "Hey there," Abigail called softly, not wanting to frighten anyone. "This is my property. You folks okay?" 10 pairs of eyes stared back at her from the shadows, 10 young faces showing a mixture of fear, defiance, and desperate hope. The children ranged in age from what looked like 4 or 5 to maybe 16, their clothes dirty and travel-worn, their faces gaunt with hunger. They held each other with the protective instincts of family, the older ones positioning themselves in front of the younger ones like a living shield. The oldest, a tall girl with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, stepped forward with chin raised despite the obvious fear in her brown eyes. "We're not stealing anything, ma'am. We just needed a place to rest." Abigail's throat constricted as she took in the full scene. 10 children who had clearly been traveling for days, maybe weeks, without adequate food or shelter. Their shoes were worn through, their clothes patched and repatched with the kind of careful mending that spoke of people who couldn't afford replacements. But it was their eyes that hit her hardest, the prematurely adult weariness of children who had seen too much, lost too much, survived too much. "The Winters Ranch," Noah, the 4-year-old, said suddenly, his tear-streaked face brightening with something that might have been hope. "Mommy said if we could find Miss Abby at the Winters Ranch, we might be safe. She said there was a lady there who understood about keeping families together." Abigail felt a chill run through her veins despite the August heat. How did this woman know her? Why would she send 10 children hundreds of miles to find a stranger? The note, "They belong with you, Abby," suggested a connection that Abigail couldn't fathom. "Did your mother tell you how she knew me?" Abigail asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Hannah shook her head. "Just that you were someone she trusted. Someone who'd understand why we needed to stay together. She left something else for you," Michael said, reaching into the inner pocket of his worn jacket. He pulled out a small envelope, this one sealed with tape rather than just folded. "Said we should only give you this after you'd heard our story. Said it would explain everything." With hands that weren't quite steady, Abigail accepted the second envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a faded photograph that made her gasp audibly. The photo showed 2 teenage girls sitting on the porch of what was unmistakably the Winters ranch house, their arms around each other's shoulders, both laughing at whoever stood behind the camera. One of the girls was clearly a younger version of Abigail herself, perhaps 15 years old. The other, "Your mother was Catherine Bennett," Abigail whispered, recognition flooding through her as she stared at the face of her childhood best friend, Kathy. The letter confirmed what the photograph had already revealed. "Abby, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and my children have somehow managed to find you. I always knew they would. They're survivors, all of them. Stubborn. Like their mother, like you. I never reached out after we lost touch because I was ashamed. My life took turns I never expected, bad relationships, struggles with addiction, the years in the system after my parents' rights were terminated. By the time I got clean and started turning things around, too many years had passed. I followed your life from afar, saw the announcement of your marriage in the Montana Stock Growers Association newsletter my rehab counselor subscribed to. Later heard about James's passing through mutual connections. When I started adopting these amazing kids, I thought often of you and James, how you always wanted a family. These children saved me, Abby, gave me purpose when I had none. And now, I'm asking you to consider whether you might save each other. They belong with you, Abby. not because of any obligation from our old friendship, but because you have what they need: space to grow, clean air to breathe, and the kind of strength that can weather any storm. And maybe, just maybe, they have what you need too: reason to keep going, hands to help with the work, hearts to fill that big house with the laughter it deserves. The choice is yours. You always were the sensible one of us too. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you like a sister all these years. Kathy. P.S. Michael knows cattle. Hannah can cook meals that would make your grandmother proud. The rest will surprise you with what they can do. They've had to grow up fast, but they're still children who deserve a chance to be children again. Abigail looked up from the letter to find 10 pairs of eyes watching her, with expressions ranging from hope to resignation. These weren't just any children who had walked hundreds of miles based on a desperate mother's instructions. These were Kathy's children, the family created by the girl who had spent summers at the Winters ranch, who had taught Abigail to braid hair and shared secrets under starlit Montana skies, who had sworn they'd be friends forever before life pulled them in different directions. "You knew my mother," Hannah said, realization dawning in her eyes. "That's why she sent us to you." "We were best friends," Abigail confirmed, her voice thick with memories. "From the time we were little girls until we weren't anymore. Life happened, we lost touch. I hadn't heard from her in over 20 years. Elena, who had been silent throughout this revelation, placed a hand on Abigail's shoulder. "What happens now, Abby?" Abigail had been dreading this moment, the return to practical realities that would shatter the fragile connection being re-established across generations. The law was clear about her obligations. 10 unaccompanied minors represented a massive liability, regardless of their circumstances or her personal feelings about their situation. A single phone call to Child Protective Services would transfer responsibility to people trained for these situations, people with resources and legal authority, and foster families already approved for placement. "We can't go back," Hannah said, with quiet desperation, reading the conflict on Abigail's face. "They'll split us up for sure. Now that we've run away, we're high-risk cases. They'll put the little ones with families and send Michael and me to group homes in different counties." "Nobody's making any calls today," Abigail said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "You all need rest, proper food, time to recover from your journey. Everything else can wait." The relief that flooded their faces was almost painful to witness. Noah actually clapped his hands together with delight, while the twins exchanged grins that transformed their thin faces. Michael's shoulders dropped as tension he'd been carrying for weeks finally had permission to ease. But Elena's expression remained troubled, and Abigail knew her friend was thinking about liability issues and legal complications and all the ways this situation could explode into crisis. A rancher harboring 10 runaway children, regardless of her motivations, was violating multiple laws and putting herself at risk of criminal charges. "There are 4 bedrooms in the main house," Abigail said, focusing on immediate needs rather than long-term consequences. "The master, James's old office that has a daybed and 2 guest rooms. We can figure out sleeping arrangements based on what works best. Girls in one room, boys in the other," Hannah suggested, her natural leadership asserting itself even in exhaustion. "However you want to organize it," Abigail agreed. "This is your temporary home. You make the rules about what feels safe and comfortable." The word home seemed to echo in the sudden quiet, carrying weight that none of them had fully anticipated. For 10 children who had spent weeks sleeping in abandoned buildings and highway underpasses, the concept of home had become almost mythical. For Abigail, who had spent 11 years living in a house that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary, home was a painful reminder of what she'd lost. But somehow, in this barn filled with morning light and the hopeful faces of children who had walked 200 miles to find her, something new was being born, not a replacement for what had been lost, but a different kind of healing. The kind that came from being needed, from mattering to someone else's survival, from remembering that love could multiply rather than diminish when shared. "Let's get you all to the house," Elena said, practical as always. "I'll call Miguel, have him bring over some extra mattresses and sleeping bags. And clothes. Carmen's kids have outgrown plenty that should fit the younger ones." As they walked toward the house, 10 children, 2 women, and a future that none of them could have imagined 24 hours earlier, Abigail felt something shifting inside her chest. The ice that had formed around her heart 11 years ago was beginning to crack, not from heat, but from the gentle pressure of small hands and young voices and the terrible, wonderful responsibility of being needed again. Behind them, the barn held its secrets and memories, but ahead lay the kitchen where James had once fed anyone who needed feeding, where his spirit seemed to whisper that some promises were worth keeping regardless of the cost. The kitchen that had sat silent and empty for 11 years suddenly erupted with life as 10 children filed through the back door. Abigail stood frozen in the doorway, watching as they instinctively organized themselves around the large oak table that James had built by hand as a 5th anniversary present. The twins naturally gravitated toward each other at one end. Michael positioned himself where he could keep watch over the younger ones, while Hannah helped Noah climb onto a chair that was too tall for his short legs. The contrast between their careful politeness and obvious exhaustion struck Abigail like a physical blow. Each child sat with hands folded, back straight, eyes downcast, the posture of people who had learned that good behavior might earn them mercy. Their clothes, which had seemed merely dirty in the barn's dim light, were revealed in the kitchen's brightness to be nearly falling apart. Holes had been patched with duct tape and safety pins. Shoes were held together with wire and hope. The youngest ones wore oversized garments that had obviously been passed down through the ranks. Each piece of clothing was a testament to their mother's resourcefulness and their own resilience. "Bathrooms upstairs if anyone needs it," Abigail said, her voice unnecessarily loud in the sudden quiet. "Clean towels in the linen closet." Hannah looked up at her with the cautious gratitude of someone who had learned not to expect kindness, but couldn't help hoping for it anyway. Could Sophia and Noah go first? "They've been trying to hold it since yesterday morning." The practical request hit Abigail with unexpected force. These children had been walking for days without access to basic sanitation, surviving on dignity and determination while facing humiliations that no child should endure. She nodded quickly, gesturing toward the stairs. "Of course, Sophia and Noah, come on. I'll show you where everything is." As she led the 2 youngest children upstairs, Abigail became acutely aware of her house through their eyes, the hardwood floors that James had refinished by hand, the family photographs lining the hallway walls, pictures of happier times when this house had been filled with laughter and possibility, the guest bedrooms that had once hosted James's endless stream of friends and family, now gathering dust behind closed doors. Sophia, the 8-year-old, stopped in front of a framed wedding photo, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Is that your husband, Miss Abby?" "Yes," Abigail said, the word catching slightly in her throat. "His name was James." "He's handsome," Sophia observed with childish directness. "Where is he now?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, but too painful to fully acknowledge. Abigail found herself kneeling to Sophia's eye level, looking into eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. "He died," she said simply, "a long time ago." Sophia nodded with the solemn acceptance of a child who had already learned that people you love don't always get to stay. "Our mommy died too. But Hannah says she's still watching us from heaven, making sure we stay together like she wanted." The bathroom was larger than their entire bedroom had been in their mother's apartment, with hot running water and soap that smelled like lavender. Abigail showed them where to find everything they needed, then retreated to give them privacy. while struggling to process the emotional weight of their simple presence in her home. Downstairs, Elena had taken charge of the practical aspects of feeding 10 hungry children. She'd found James's old cast-iron skillets and was assembling ingredients for what looked like enough pancakes to feed a small army. Michael had somehow located the oversized bag of flour that Abigail kept for the occasional visiting ranch hand, while Hannah supervised the twins as they carefully arranged plates around the table. "Your husband," Hannah said as Abigail returned to the kitchen. "He must have been a good cook. This kitchen feels like it was made for feeding people." Abigail's throat tightened at the accuracy of her observation. James had indeed designed this space for gatherings, insisting on extra counter space and a table that could expand to seat 16. He'd dreamed of holiday dinners and birthday parties, summer barbecues, and impromptu celebrations. The kitchen had been the heart of those dreams, and after his death, it had become a mausoleum of might-have-beens. He was, she managed, always said food was how you showed love. Jackson, the 10-year-old with an apparent gift for precise observation, was studying the refrigerator with the intensity of a detective. "You've got pictures of your whole family," he announced, "but they're all old. How come you don't have new ones?" The innocent question pierced through Abigail's carefully maintained defenses. She looked at the collection of photographs held by aging magnates, images of herself and James at various stages of their marriage, pictures of family gatherings and ranch celebrations, moments frozen in time when the future had seemed bright and certain. "Hard to take pictures when you're the only one left," she said quietly. Mason, the 7-year-old who had been silent since entering the house, surprised everyone by speaking up. "We take pictures of each other all the time. Hannah's got a camera phone that still works sometimes. Want to see?" Before Abigail could respond, Hannah was digging through her battered backpack, producing a phone with a cracked screen and a case held together with electrical tape. Despite its condition, the device powered on, revealing a gallery of images that told the story of 10 children creating their own documentation of love and survival. There were pictures from their journey, the twins sharing a candy bar they'd found, Michael piggyback carrying Noah when his legs gave out, all 10 of them sleeping in a circle under an overpass during a rainstorm. But mixed in with the travel photos were older images, birthday celebrations in their modest apartment, homework sessions around a kitchen table, bedtime stories read by flashlight when the electricity had been shut off. "Mom said memories were the only things nobody could take away from you," Hannah explained, scrolling through the photos with the careful reverence of someone handling precious artifacts. "So we take lots of them." Abigail found herself studying the images over Hannah's shoulder, struck by the joy visible in even the most difficult circumstances. These children had faced poverty, illness, loss, and uncertainty, yet their photographs captured genuine happiness, the kind that came from being loved unconditionally and loving each other the same way. Elena called everyone to the table as the last pancake was completed. The meal she'd assembled was simple but substantial: golden pancakes drizzled with the last of Abigail's maple syrup, scrambled eggs from the chickens that still roamed the farmyard, and glasses of cold milk that Elena had brought in a cooler in her truck. To the children, it might as well have been a feast prepared by royalty. They ate with the focused intensity of people who couldn't be certain when their next meal might come. But they also displayed table manners that spoke of careful training and respect for the food being offered. No one grabbed or complained or asked for seconds until everyone had finished their first serving. The older children automatically helped the younger ones, cutting pancakes into manageable pieces and wiping faces with the practiced efficiency of experienced caregivers. "Mom always said grace before meals," Emily mentioned quietly, glancing around the table with uncertainty. "But we weren't sure if you did that here." Abigail hadn't said grace in 11 years, hadn't felt grateful enough for anything to warrant formal acknowledgement of divine providence. But looking at these 10 faces watching her expectantly, she found herself nodding. "Go ahead." Hannah reached out to take the hands of the children on either side of her, and without discussion, the rest of them followed suit until 10 pairs of hands were linked around the table. Abigail hesitated for a moment before allowing Noah to take her left hand and Elena to take her right, completing a circle that seemed to pulse with its own energy. "Thank you for this food," Hannah said, her voice carrying the clear cadence of someone who had led this ritual many times before. "Thank you for people who share what they have with people who need it. Thank you for keeping us safe on our journey. And thank you for helping us stay together like Mom wanted. Amen." The simple prayer hit Abigail with unexpected force. Here were children who had every reason to feel abandoned by whatever divine power might exist, yet they still offered gratitude for small kindnesses and maintained faith that love could overcome bureaucratic obstacles. Their mother had raised them to see providence in human compassion, to recognize miracles in the form of pancakes and temporary shelter. As they ate, the children began to relax enough to share pieces of their story. Michael talked about his mother's final weeks, how she had used her remaining strength to teach them practical survival skills, while making them promise to protect each other no matter what came next. The twins described their terror when the social workers first arrived, how they had hidden under their beds hoping that if they couldn't be seen, they couldn't be separated. Jackson revealed his talent for remembering numbers and distances, explaining how he had calculated their walking pace and estimated arrival times at various checkpoints along their route. Sophia showed off her ability to identify edible plants, a skill their mother had taught her using library books and careful practice. Mason demonstrated his talent for finding shelter, describing how he could spot potential sleeping places that would keep them hidden from highway patrol while providing protection from weather. Each child had been given specific responsibilities and specialized knowledge, Abigail realized. Their mother had created a survival unit where every member contributed essential skills. Hannah led and made decisions. Michael provided physical protection and carried the heaviest loads. The twins served as scouts, small enough to investigate spaces the older ones couldn't access. Jackson navigated and tracked their progress. Sophia foraged for supplemental food sources. Mason found shelter. Ava and Noah served as their collective hope, the reminder of innocence worth protecting. "What happens now?" Alina asked during a lull in the conversation, voicing the question that hung over everything like a storm cloud. Abigail had been dreading this moment, the return to practical realities that would shatter the fragile magic of shared meals and tentative connections. The law was clear about her obligations. 10 unaccompanied minors represented a massive liability, regardless of their circumstances or her personal feelings about their situation. A single phone call to Child Protective Services would transfer responsibility to people trained for these situations, people with resources and legal authority, and foster families already approved for placement. "We can't go back," Hannah said. With quiet desperation, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "They'll split us up for sure now. Running away makes us high-risk cases. They'll put the little ones with families and send Michael and me to group homes in different counties." "Nobody's making any calls today," Abigail said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "You all need rest, proper food, time to recover from your journey. Everything else can wait." The relief that flooded their faces was almost painful to witness. Noah actually clapped his hands together with delight, while the twins exchanged grins that transformed their thin faces. Michael's shoulders dropped as tension he'd been carrying for weeks finally had permission to ease. But Elena's expression remained troubled, and Abigail knew her friend was thinking about liability issues and legal complications and all the ways this situation could explode into crisis. A rancher harboring 10 runaway children, regardless of her motivations, was violating multiple laws and putting herself at risk of criminal charges. "I need to head back to my place," Alina said finally, rising from the table. "Miguel will be wondering where I disappeared to, and I promised to help Carmen with the farmer's market prep. I'll bring those mattresses by this evening, along with some clothes and extra groceries." She fixed Abigail with a meaningful look that clearly said, "We need to talk about this privately." Abigail nodded, walking her friend to the door. On the porch, out of earshot of the children, Alina turned to her with concern etched across her features. "Abby, what are you thinking? 10 kids? Social services will be looking for them. You could get in serious trouble." "I know," Abigail admitted. "But you saw them, Elena. They walked over 200 miles to stay together. And Kathy, she was like a sister to me once. How can I be the one who makes the call that tears her family apart?" Elena's expression softened. "I understand, but you need to think this through. Your heart's in the right place, but good intentions won't matter if you're charged with kidnapping or interfering with a state investigation." "I'm not keeping them forever," Abigail said, though a part of her wondered if that was entirely true. "Just until I can figure out a legal way to help them stay together. There has to be a path through this that doesn't end with 10 kids scattered across the state system. Just be careful," Elena cautioned, "and call me if you need anything. Anything at all." After Elena left, Abigail returned to the kitchen to find the children had already organized themselves into cleanup crews with the efficiency of people accustomed to shared responsibilities. Hannah was directing operations from the sink where she washed dishes, Michael was drying, the twins were putting away leftovers, and the younger ones were wiping down the table and sweeping the floor. "You don't have to do that," Abigail protested. "We always help," Sophia said simply. "Mom said a family works together." Family. The word hung in the air between them, weighted with both possibility and uncertainty. The first day passed in a blur of practical arrangements. Beds were made in all available spaces, with the girls taking the largest guest room and the boys settling into James's old office and the second guest room. Showers were organized in rotation, with the oldest helping the youngest navigate unfamiliar fixtures. Abigail dug through storage bins in the attic, finding clothes that might serve as temporary placements for their travel-worn garments, old t-shirts of James's that could serve as nightgowns for the girls, work shirts that Michael could wear, even a few items from her own childhood that her mother had preserved and might fit the younger children. By evening, Elena returned as promised, her truck loaded with supplies, air mattresses, sleeping bags, bags of children's clothing collected from neighbors with growing families, and groceries enough to feed an army for a week. Miguel came with her, bringing tools to help set up temporary beds and a guitar that he placed in the living room for after-dinner music, like when I was a boy. The communal dinner that night felt like something from another life. The dining room table extended to its full length, chairs borrowed from every room in the house, the sound of children's voices filling spaces that had been silent for too long. Miguel played his guitar after the meal, teaching the younger children simple songs in Spanish, while the older ones helped with dishes and bedtime preparations. When Abigail finally retreated to her own room late that night, after checking that each child was safely tucked into bed, she found herself sitting on the edge of her mattress, overwhelmed by the day's events. The house around her hummed with the unfamiliar sounds of sleeping children, soft breathing, occasional mumbles, the creak of floorboards as someone navigated to the bathroom in the darkness. On her nightstand, Kathy's letter lay open beside the photograph of 2 teenage girls who couldn't have imagined the paths their lives would take. "They belong with you, Abby." 5 words that had shattered her carefully constructed isolation and forced her to confront possibilities she'd long since abandoned. Sleep claimed her eventually, deeper and more restful than any she'd experienced in years. Morning arrived with the sound of children's voices drifting up from the kitchen below. Abigail opened her eyes to sunlight streaming through curtains. She'd forgotten to close, momentarily disoriented by the noise and movement in a house that had been silent for so long. The bedside clock read 7:15, later than she'd slept in years. Downstairs, she found organized chaos in progress. Hannah stood at the stove, confidently flipping eggs in James's favorite cast-iron skillet. Michael was outside, visible through the window as he fed the chickens with Noah perched on his shoulders. The twins had set the table with military precision, while Jackson supervised Ava and Mason as they mixed orange juice from the concentrate Elena had brought. "Morning, Miss Abby," Sophia called cheerfully from her position at the toaster. "Hannah said to let you sleep. You looked tired yesterday." "We made breakfast," Hannah added, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "Hope that's okay. We wanted to help." "It's more than okay," Abigail assured her, taking in the scene with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. "I can't remember the last time someone cooked for me." The day established patterns that would carry them through the weeks to come. After breakfast, Michael asked about ranch chores, his expression making it clear that he expected to contribute rather than merely receive hospitality. Abigail found herself leading him and the twins to the barn, showing them the basics of feeding, schedules, and livestock management. Michael's knowledge surprised her. He asked intelligent questions about feed ratios and vaccination schedules, demonstrating an understanding of cattle behavior that spoke of genuine research and interest. The twins proved to be natural hands with the horses, their quiet movements and gentle voices calming even the most temperamental animals. Back at the house, Hannah had organized the younger children into cleaning crews, tackling years of accumulated dust in unused rooms and bringing order to spaces that had been neglected far too long. By midday, windows gleamed in the summer sun, floors shone with fresh polish, and the covered furniture in the formal living room had been unveiled to reveal pieces that hadn't seen use since James's funeral. "Your house is beautiful," Hannah told Abigail as they worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing lunch for 12. "Mom would have loved it here, all this space, the big kitchen, rooms for everyone." "James always wanted a big family," Abigail admitted, the words coming easier than she expected. "We tried for years, but it didn't happen for us. Then he got sick and—" She trailed off, surprised by how readily she was sharing thoughts she'd kept locked inside for more than a decade. Hannah nodded, understanding beyond her years in her eyes. "Sometimes life doesn't go how you plan. Mom used to say that a lot. Said the trick was finding beauty in the path you ended up on, even if it wasn't the one you chose." That afternoon, Abigail found Sophia in the overgrown garden behind the house, carefully examining what remained of the vegetables James had planted in his final summer. The girl moved methodically between rows, pulling weeds and testing soil with her fingers. "Some of these can be saved," she announced when she noticed Abigail watching. "The tomatoes especially. They're tough plants. And look, there are volunteer squash coming up where someone must have thrown out seeds last year. Would you like to help me bring it back?" Abigail asked impulsively. "The garden, I mean." Sophia's face lit up with pure joy. "Really?" "I was the garden helper at home. Mom said I had a green thumb." Together, they spent the afternoon clearing weeds and salvaging what they could, Sophia chattering constantly about companion planting strategies and natural pest control methods she'd learned from library books. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Abigail found herself imagining next year's garden, rows of vegetables stretching beyond the current boundaries, perhaps a greenhouse for winter growing, maybe even fruit trees along the southern edge of the property. Next year, the thought stopped her cold. There was no guarantee these children would be here next year, no certainty that any plans they made now would have time to come to fruition. They were living in a fragile bubble of temporary arrangements, one phone call away from shattering everything they were beginning to build. That evening, after the younger children were in bed, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with Michael, Hannah, and Olivia, the three oldest, who carried the weight of their siblings' future on their young shoulders. "We need to talk about what happens next," Abigail said gently. "I promised you time to rest and recover, and you've had that. But we can't pretend the outside world doesn't exist forever. Sooner or later, someone's going to come looking for you." The three teenagers exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that spoke of countless similar conversations. "We know," Hannah said finally. "We've been waiting for you to bring it up." "I'm not calling social services," Abigail assured them quickly. "Not yet anyway. But we need a plan. A legal way to keep you all together, if that's possible." "Is it?" Michael asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Possible, I mean. 10 kids is a lot. Nobody wants that many, especially not when half of us are teenagers with issues." He made air quotes around the last word, bitterness evident in his tone. "I don't know," Abigail admitted honestly, "but I think we should find out. There's a lawyer in town, Tom Whitehorse. He handles a lot of family cases, adoptions, guardianships. If anyone would know our options, it's him." "And if there aren't any good options?" Olivia asked, speaking the fear they all shared. Abigail reached across the table to take her hand. "Then we'll make one. I promised you time, and that promise still stands. No one is separating you while you're under my roof." The resolved statement surprised even her with its conviction, but as soon as the words left her mouth, Abigail knew they were true. Something had shifted inside her during these few days with the Brennan children, a reawakening of purpose, a rekindling of the fierce protectiveness that had once defined her relationship with the ranch and everyone on it. "Why are you helping us?" Hannah asked quietly. "I mean, really helping us. You barely knew our mom, not for years anyway. You don't owe us anything." Abigail considered the question carefully, knowing these children had faced too many broken promises to accept glib reassurances. "When James died," she began slowly, "something in me died too. The part that could see possibilities, that could imagine a future different from the present. I've been going through the motions for 11 years, not really living, just existing, keeping the ranch running because it was easier than deciding what else to do with my life." She looked at each of their faces, Michael's guarded hope, Hannah's careful assessment, Olivia's barely concealed longing for stability. "When you showed up in my barn with that note, it was like someone threw open a door I'd forgotten existed. You reminded me that there are more important things than just surviving day to day. Your mother knew that. She fought to keep you together because she understood that family isn't just about blood or legal documents. It's about belonging to each other, choosing each other every day." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, conviction replacing uncertainty. "I don't know what's going to happen next. I can't promise you that the system will suddenly start working in your favor. But I can promise that you're not alone in this fight anymore. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The expression on Hannah's face transformed slowly from cautious assessment to something that might have been hope. "Together," she repeated, the word carrying weight far beyond its simple syllables. That night, long after the teenagers had gone to bed, Abigail sat alone on the porch swing that James had hung their first summer on the ranch. The August sky stretched above her, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet darkness. In the distance, coyotes called to each other, their haunting voices carrying across the open land. For the first time in 11 years, Abigail allowed herself to imagine a future different from her present. The ranch thriving again, with young hands to help with the work. The house filled with voices and laughter, holidays around the big dining room table, graduations to celebrate, dreams to nurture, lives intertwined by choice rather than obligation. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, the possibility of caring that deeply again, of having so much to lose. But as she rocked gently in the night breeze, Abigail realized that the alternative, returning to her solitary existence after these children were gone, was infinitely more frightening. Somehow, in just a few days, 10 wounded souls had reawakened her capacity for hope, reminding her that a heart could heal even after being shattered. Tomorrow they would drive into town to meet with Tom Whitehorse, taking the first steps toward whatever future awaited them. Tonight, under the vast Montana sky, Abigail made a silent promise to the memory of her best friend and to the children sleeping under her roof. She would fight with everything she had to keep this newfound family together, to honor Kathy's final wish and her own reawakened heart. The porch swing creaked gently as she stood, a sound that had always reminded her of James. For a moment, she could almost feel his presence beside her, his approving smile as she finally stepped out of the shadow of grief and back into the fullness of life. "I think I understand now," she whispered to the night air. "What you meant about the ranch having good bones. It wasn't just the buildings or the land. It was the foundation for something more, a place where broken pieces could come together and create something whole." As Abigail turned to go inside, a shooting star blazed across the sky, brief, brilliant, and beautiful. Like life itself, she thought. Like love. Like second chances that appeared when you least expected them. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Abigail prepared to take the children into town. This would be their first public appearance in Silver Creek, and the magnitude of what they were attempting wasn't lost on anyone. 10 children couldn't exactly slip into a lawyer's office unnoticed in a town with barely 2,000 residents. "Maybe we should split up," Hannah suggested as they gathered around the breakfast table. "Michael and I could go with you to see the lawyer, and the others could stay here." "No," Abigail said firmly. "We're doing this together, all of us." She looked around at the 10 faces watching her with varying degrees of anxiety and trust. "If we're going to build a case for keeping you together, we need to show that it's possible, that you function as a unit, that separating you would cause genuine harm." "But what if someone recognizes us?" Olivia asked, worry creasing her forehead. "What if they call social services before we even get to talk to the lawyer?" It was a valid concern. Their photographs had likely been distributed to law enforcement across the state when they were reported missing. "That's why we're going to be completely upfront about who you are," Abigail explained. "No hiding, no sneaking around. We're going to walk straight into Tom Whitehorse's office and tell him everything. He's bound by attorney-client privilege. He can't report you without our permission." The plan still carried risks, but after discussing alternatives, everyone agreed it was their best option. They piled into Abigail's truck and Elena's SUV, which she had insisted on lending them after hearing about their mission. The convoy made its way down the long gravel drive toward the main road, dust billowing behind them in the morning sun. Silver Creek appeared on the horizon after 20 minutes of driving, a small collection of buildings nestled in a valley between rolling hills. The town had seen better days, with several empty storefronts on Main Street testifying to the economic challenges facing rural communities. But it maintained a certain charm with its brick courthouse, white steepled church, and the Silver Creek Mercantile that had served the area for over a century. As they drove slowly down Main Street, Abigail felt the weight of curious eyes following their progress. It wasn't often that a procession of vehicles carrying so many children passed through town, especially not with Abigail Winters at the wheel. She had become something of a recluse in recent years, appearing in town only when absolutely necessary for supplies or business at the bank. Tom Whitehorse's law office occupied the ground floor of a historic building across from the courthouse. Its windows bore gold lettering announcing Whitehorse Legal Services, Family Law, Estate Planning, Business Contracts. As Abigail parked in front, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what would undoubtedly be a challenging conversation. "Ready?" she asked, looking at the children who had crowded into her truck. 5 solemn faces nodded back at her. In the SUV behind them, Elena's 5 passengers were already climbing out, staying close together as they always did in unfamiliar situations. The bell above the door jingled as they entered the reception area. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair looked up from her computer, her expression shifting from professional welcome to astonishment as child after child filed in behind Abigail. "We need to see Tom," Abigail said without preamble. "It's urgent." Margaret Whitehorse, Tom's wife and office manager, had known Abigail since they were both in Silver Creek High School. Whatever questions burned in her eyes, she kept them to herself, merely nodding and pressing the intercom button on her desk. "Tom, Abigail Winters is here to see you, with company." A moment later, the inner office door opened to reveal Tom Whitehorse, a tall man in his 50s with the broad shoulders of the college football player he'd once been, and the shrewd eyes of the attorney he'd become. Like his wife, he masked his surprise at the procession of children, merely gesturing toward his conference room. "Looks like we'll need the bigger space," he said mildly. "Come on through." The conference room barely accommodated them all. The younger children instinctively arranged themselves around Hannah and Michael, while Abigail took the seat directly across from Tom at the head of the table. "So," Tom said once they were all settled, "I'm guessing this isn't about updating your will." "These are the Brennan children," Abigail said directly. "They're currently listed as missing persons in the Montana child welfare system. Their mother, Catherine Brennan, Kathy Bennett, when we knew her, died of cancer a month ago. Before she died, she sent them to find me because the system was going to separate them into different foster homes." Tom's expression didn't change, but his pen stilled on the legal pad where he'd been taking notes. "I see," he said carefully, "and you're here because I want to know if there's any legal way to keep them together, all of them, with me, if possible." For the next hour, Abigail and the older children took turns explaining their situation: Kathy's illness and death, the foster care plans that would have scattered 10 siblings across the state, their desperate journey to find the woman their mother had trusted to understand the importance of family bonds. Tom listened without interruption, making occasional notes, but otherwise giving no indication of his thoughts. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, studying each face around the table before returning his gaze to Abigail. "What you're asking is complicated," he said finally. 10 children is unprecedented in my experience, especially given that you have no prior relationship with them as recognized by the state. Single foster parents typically aren't approved for more than 2 children, maybe 3 in special circumstances. "But they already live as a unit," Abigail argued. "They've been functioning as a family for years. Splitting them up would cause more trauma than whatever theoretical benefit the state thinks might come from proper family units." Tom held up a hand. "I understand your position. I'm just explaining the barriers we're facing." He turned a page in his legal pad. "That said, there might be possibilities. Emergency kinship placement could be an option, given your friendship with their mother, though it would be a stretch of the usual definition of kinship. What would that involve?" Hannah asked, leaning forward intently. "A petition to the court, character references, home inspection, financial disclosure to show you can support them," Tom explained, addressing Abigail. "And that's just to get temporary custody while pursuing more permanent arrangements." "How? Temporary?" Michael's voice carried the wariness of someone who had learned that temporary often meant until something better comes along. 60 to 90 days, typically, Tom answered honestly, during which time you'd need to complete foster parent certification, demonstrate adequate living conditions for 10 children, and petition for permanent guardianship or adoption. Abigail felt a flicker of hope at the word adoption, though. She kept her expression neutral. "And what are the chances of success?" Tom's silence spoke volumes before he finally answered. "If we're being realistic, low. The system isn't designed for situations like this. It's built around the model of 1 or 2 children being placed with traditional nuclear families." The disappointment around the table was palpable. Noah began to cry softly, while the twins reached for each other's hands in an unconscious gesture of solidarity. "But," Tom continued, his voice taking on a determined edge that hadn't been there before, "the system isn't always right, and sometimes, when the system fails to serve the best interests of children, it can be persuaded to make exceptions." He leaned forward, making eye contact with each child in turn. "I need to be clear. This won't be easy. We'll be fighting uphill against bureaucracy, regulations, and people who genuinely believe they know what's best for you. But if you're all committed to this, if you're willing to work together and be patient through what might be a long process, I think we might have a chance." "We are," Hannah said immediately, no hesitation in her voice. "We've already walked over 200 miles to stay together. Whatever it takes, we'll do it." Tom nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "Then let's get started." He pulled a stack of forms from a cabinet behind him. "Abigail, we'll need to file for emergency kinship placement immediately. That gets us in the door, buys us some time while we build the case for permanent custody." For the next 2 hours, they worked through initial paperwork, detailed information about each child, their medical history, educational background, special needs or considerations. Tom explained that he would file the petition that afternoon, requesting an emergency hearing before a judge as soon as possible. "What about school?" Abigail asked suddenly, realizing September was approaching rapidly. "They need to be enrolled, but if we're not legal guardians yet." "I know the superintendent," Tom said. "Jim Carson. Good man. Once we file the emergency petition, I'll talk to him about provisional enrollment pending the hearing. These kids have been through enough disruption without missing the start of the school year." As they prepared to leave, Tom asked to speak with Abigail privately for a moment. The children waited in the reception area while she remained behind in the conference room. "Abby," Tom said once they were alone, dropping the professional formality, "I need to be absolutely certain you understand what you're taking on. 10 children, 6 of them teenagers or nearly so, will transform your life in ways you can't even imagine. The financial burden alone is enormous, not to mention the emotional demands, the logistics of daily life, educational needs, healthcare." "I know," Abigail interrupted gently. "I've thought about all of that. Have you?" Tom pressed. "Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like a decision made in the heat of the moment, based on an emotional connection to your old friend and these undeniably compelling children. But emotion isn't enough to sustain a family through years of challenges." Abigail considered his words carefully, respecting the concern behind them. "When James died," she said finally, "I stopped living. I existed, I kept the ranch running, but I wasn't really alive anymore. These past few days with the children have reminded me what it feels like to have purpose, to be needed, to look toward the future instead of just surviving the present." She met his gaze directly. "I'm not naive, Tom. I know this will be the hardest thing I've ever done. But I also know it's the right thing, for them and for me. We fit together in ways I can't fully explain. They need a home where they can stay together, and I need a reason to build something again instead of just watching what I have slowly fall apart." Tom studied her face for a long moment before nodding. "All right, then we'll fight this battle together. Just know that at some point, probably soon, someone is going to ask why a single woman with financial challenges of her own would want to take on the responsibility of 10 traumatized children. You need a better answer than 'it felt right.'" "I'll work on that," Abigail promised with a small smile. The drive back to the ranch was quieter than the journey into town, each person lost in their own thoughts about the challenges ahead. As they turned onto the long driveway leading to the house, Abigail noticed a silver sedan parked near the front porch, an unfamiliar vehicle with government plates. Her heart sank. Someone had recognized the children in town. Someone had made a call. "Stay in the truck," she instructed sharply as she parked, but Michael was already opening his door. "No," he said firmly. "We face this together, remember? All of us. A woman in her 40s stood on the porch, clipboard in hand, her expression professionally neutral as she watched their approach. She wore a navy blue blazer despite the August heat, her brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Ms. Winters?" she called as Abigail led the procession of children toward the house. "I'm Rebecca Sandoval from Montana Child and Family Services. I believe we need to talk." Abigail stepped in front of the children instinctively, as if she could physically shield them from the system this woman represented. "We've just come from meeting with our attorney, Tom Whitehorse. He's filing for emergency kinship placement this afternoon." "I'm aware," Miss Sandoval replied, surprising them all. "Tom called me before you left his office. That's why I'm here, to conduct the initial home evaluation." The tension vibrating through the group eased slightly, though wariness remained in the older children's postures. "Usually we schedule these visits," Miss Sandoval continued, "but given the unusual circumstances, I thought it best to move quickly. May I come in?" The next 3 hours were among the most stressful Abigail had ever experienced. Miss Sandoval toured the entire property, measuring bedrooms, inspecting bathrooms, examining the kitchen, checking smoke detectors, and window locks. She interviewed each child separately, spending extra time with the older ones. She reviewed Abigail's financial records, asked pointed questions about educational plans, daily schedules, discipline philosophy, and support systems. Through it all, Abigail fought to maintain her composure, answering honestly while recognizing that this woman's report would significantly impact their chances of staying together. The children, seeming to understand the stakes, were on their best behavior, polite, articulate, demonstrating the close bonds they shared without appearing rehearsed. When Miss Sandoval finally packed up her clipboard and prepared to leave, her professional mask had softened slightly. "You have beautiful children," she said to Abigail, the deliberate phrasing not lost on anyone. "They clearly care deeply for one another." "They do," Abigail agreed cautiously. "I'll be submitting my report to Judge Layton this evening. The emergency hearing is scheduled for Thursday morning at 9. Miss Sandoval hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, Ms. Winters, what you're trying to do here, keeping these siblings together, I respect that. It's what we aim for in the system, even if resources don't always allow it." After she left, the children gathered anxiously in the living room, looking to Abigail for reassurance she wasn't entirely sure she could provide. "What happens now?" Ava asked, her small voice tight with worry. "Now we prepare for Thursday," Abigail said with more confidence than she felt. "We'll meet with Tom again tomorrow to go over what to expect at the hearing. And in the meantime, we continue doing what we've been doing, working together, showing that we're already functioning as a family." "But what if the judge says no?" Sophia's question voiced the fear they all shared. Abigail knelt to look the 8-year-old in the eyes. "Then we appeal, we fight. We don't give up after one setback." "Mom always said that too," Mason offered. "Quietly," said, "giving up just guarantees you won't get what you want." "Your mom was a very wise woman," Abigail agreed, feeling a renewed connection to the friend she'd lost touch with so many years ago. Kathy's strength lived on in these children, in their resilience and determination to stay together despite overwhelming odds. That evening, as darkness fell over the ranch, Elena arrived with dinner for everyone, massive pots of her famous chili and cornbread still warm from her oven. She'd brought Miguel and their 3 grown children as well, turning the meal into an impromptu gathering that filled the dining room with more voices and laughter than it had heard in over a decade. Carmen Rodriguez, Elena's oldest daughter, pulled Abigail aside after dinner. "We've been talking, Mama and I," she said without preamble, "about your situation with the children." "Oh?" Abigail responded cautiously. "The Farmers Market Committee is meeting tomorrow night. We want to organize a community support effort clothing drives, school supplies, maybe even a fundraiser to help with legal expenses. Carmen's expression was earnest. These kids deserve a chance to stay together, and you shouldn't have to shoulder this alone. Abigail felt a lump form in her throat at the unexpected offer. That's incredibly generous, but nothing. Carmen interrupted firmly. Silver Creek takes care of its own, always has. These children might be new here, but they're under your roof, which makes them part of our community now. After the Rodriguez family left, Abigail sat on the porch with Hannah and Michael, watching the younger children chase fireflies in the front yard, a simple pleasure they'd never experienced in their city apartment. They're happy here, Hannah said softly. Even with everything uncertain, they're happier than they've been since Mom got sick. They have space to breathe, Michael added. Room to run without worrying about traffic or strangers. They don't have to be quiet all the time, so the neighbors don't complain. Abigail watched as Jackson patiently showed Noah how to cup his hands around a firefly, releasing it gently after admiring its glow. It's more than just space, she observed. It's freedom to be children again, not just survivors. The conversation drifted to practical matters: what to wear to court, how to prepare the younger ones for the hearing, what questions the judge might ask. But beneath these immediate concerns flowed a deeper current of connection, a sense that regardless of legal definitions, they were already becoming a family, bound by shared purpose and growing affection. As the children reluctantly came inside for bedtime routines, Abigail found herself reflecting on the transformation that had occurred in just a few short days. The house that had been a mausoleum to lost dreams now vibrated with life and possibility. Rooms that had gathered dust for years now echoed with children's voices. The dining table that had seemed excessive for a solitary woman now barely accommodated their nightly gatherings. Even the ranch itself seemed to be responding to the influx of energy and purpose. Michael and the twins had already made noticeable improvements to the barn's organization. Sophia's careful attention had revived plants in the garden that Abigail had assumed were beyond saving. Jackson had developed a computerized feeding schedule that promised to reduce waste and improve efficiency. They belonged here. The realization struck Abigail with the force of absolute certainty. These children, with their unique skills and boundless determination, belonged on this land that had sustained her family for generations. And she belonged with them, not as a replacement for the mother they'd lost, but as someone who could provide the stability and protection they desperately needed. Thursday's hearing would determine whether the legal system recognized what Abigail already knew in her heart, that sometimes family is formed not by blood or birth certificates, but by courage, choice, and the willingness to fight for each other against impossible odds. As she moved through the house that night, checking on sleeping children before retiring to her own room, Abigail paused in the doorway of the girls' bedroom. In the soft glow of the nightlight, she could see Sophia and Ava curled together on one mattress, Hannah's protective arm draped over both of them, even in sleep. On the next bed, Olivia lay with an open book still in her hands, apparently having fallen asleep while reading to the younger girls. The scene brought unexpected tears to Abigail's eyes, not the bitter tears of grief she'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer and more complex. These children had known loss and hardship beyond their years, yet they still found ways to care for each other, to create moments of beauty and comfort in whatever circumstances they found themselves. They belong with you, Abby. Kathy's words echoed in her mind as she quietly closed the door. Tomorrow they would face the first major test of that belief. Tonight, under this roof, it already felt like truth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.